I'm slow on this. I started with, chalk and a blackboard a long time ago. And what I want to talk with you about today, just for a short time, is the role of Franklin Roosevelt in the formation of the United Nations. And part of this is driven by the scholarship in history dealing with a lot of Roosevelt's achievements, where Roosevelt he was a very secretive person. He didn't leave detailed explanations of what he was doing. He didn't live long enough to write a memoir. He didn't. He took very few, if any, people into his confidence, really. And so sorting out what he was really doing, what he wanted to do, is always a bit problematic. Any effort like that is also burdened with the fact that those who lived after he died in April of 1945, and those who lived after him wrote their memoirs. And you will find, if you spend much time with the memoirs, that they take credit for an awful lot of what happened at the expense of Franklin Roosevelt, it seems to me. I just want to kind of balance things in that. Let me admit Charlie there. Okay. Now, I want to understand, first of all, that Roosevelt really was trying to find a way to stay out of the war. The old conspiracy theories that he set the Navy up at Pearl Harbor and things like that just make no sense. He did not want to enter a war for any reason at all, unless it was absolutely forced to. And the question is, why did we finally do it? He understood that the United States, he had to lead the United States to overcome this tradition of what we called isolationism, which is always a little bit of a misleading term. But what it means for the United States in these years is that the U.S. had rejected the Treaty of Versailles at the conclusion of the First World War. The U.S. had refused to join the League of Nations. The United States did sign the General Treaty for the Renunciation of War, the so-called Kellogg-Briand Pact in 1928, because our Secretary of State, Frank Kellogg, had negotiated the peace pact as it came to be known. The United States also refused to join the World Court. And what it amounts to is that the United States simply refuses to take part in these global enterprises to try and maintain some kind of global order. And that is to set up means of containing irresponsible international impulses. Now, we've seen these guardrails being demolished today. And I think that will create a set of circumstances that will create extremely difficult to maintain any kind of world order once we move on from this moment in our history. Anyway, I want to begin with, this is what Roosevelt said, and Eleanor Roosevelt recalls this, that in the dark days of the winter of 1941-42, Franklin Roosevelt said, when this war is over and we have won it, as we will, we must apply the hard lessons learned from the war and in the failure of the League of Nations to the task of building a society of nations dedicated to enduring peace. There will be sacrifices and discouragements, but we must not fail, for we may never have another chance. Now, what I want you to see is that he had the idea of the post-war structure of what the world should look like at the very beginning. Of course, he wants to win the war. That's the first priority. No question about that. But how do you proceed after this? Let's see. Where's this? There. Why doesn't this? I can't get those together. Well, all right. This is just a picture. I compare this with the final slide here, what Roosevelt looks like in 1945. He still looks reasonably healthy here, but it's very clear that the job has been starting to take a toll. But he sets noble war aims for this conflict very early. His Four Freedoms speech, included in the annual message to Congress in January of 1941, lays out freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. The four basic freedoms he lays out. Now, you may recall, you may have seen the Norman Rockwell representations of these four freedoms. That's always a little bit misleading, and it's unfortunate they were used for propaganda purposes solely in the United States, because Roosevelt intended these to be universal freedoms. And he says at the end of each one, everywhere in the world, freedom of speech, everywhere in the world, freedom of religion, everywhere in the world, freedom from want, everywhere in the world, and so on, freedom from fear. All right, so he sets this up. Second major way of outlining what this war is going to be about for the United States is the Atlantic Charter of August 1914. And there's especially misunderstandings about the celebrated eighth paragraph of the Atlantic Charter. It refers to the restoration of freedom for the subject peoples. And it doesn't specify whether the subject peoples are confined solely to Europe or to the globe. And Winston Churchill was very careful to inform his cabinet, since he was present when this was drafted, that it applied only to the occupied territories of Europe, currently occupied by Nazi Germany. Roosevelt saw it very differently. What Churchill never really appreciated was what an anti-imperialist Roosevelt really was. Roosevelt wanted to dismantle the colonial empires. And his first step, one of the first things he tried to get Churchill to do, was to grant dominion status to India. But Churchill could not conceive of the idea of a non-white dominion within the context of the British Empire. Roosevelt also made plans during the war itself for to the French possessions in Indochina, which we've come to know as Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Those possessions he wanted to turn over to the United Nations once it was created, and did not want those territories returned to France once the war is over. And one of the really grim moments that occurs in our history is Roosevelt died April 12th, 1945. The next day, April 13th, 1945, a joint committee of the State Department, the Navy Department, the War Department began a re-examination of our policy toward the French Empire with the idea of restoring all of French imperial possessions to France so that France could restore its great power status. The next day, they do this. Anyway, so there's great opposition. Hey, look, don't hesitate to interrupt me. I taught long enough. I've got thin hide,
It's okay.
Oh, hit that. Okay, I'll do that. I'm sorry. There. How's that? Is that better? Okay, great. Now, what am I doing? This is a school poster that was distributed to American schools during the war to promote the Atlantic Charter and what it was going to do. It was all about where trade occurs and so on, and just to illustrate to the American people how important globalism is, how important internationalism, and to start with grade schoolers. And I just put it in. The second major thing that Roosevelt does on January 1st, 1942, there's a declaration of the United Nations. It's the first time the term United Nations is used. And Roosevelt insists on this. And it's a statement from 22 countries that signed it, that they will cooperate and join together to defeat the adversaries, Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and the Japanese militarism. Okay, it's the first time the term United Nations is used. And Roosevelt also, to Churchill's chagrin, insists on India being a signatory to this agreement. And this happens in January 1st, 1942. He's pushing as hard as he can for India to dismantle, as much as he can of the British Empire. Now, what I want you to see here is the way in which Roosevelt, I'll use the term orchestrates, the growth of public support for internationalism. Now, he understood how powerful this isolationist sentiment was, and he knew he had to proceed very carefully to overcome that isolationist sentiment in the American public. And he works through representatives. And the first one I want to call your attention to is a man by the name of Sumner Welles. He was the Assistant Secretary of State. And Welles gave two speeches in July of 1941, before we entered the war. He gave a speech at the dedication of a new building in the Norwegian embassy called an Association of Nations, in which he announced that has to be the goal, some kind of association of nations after the war in order to achieve a viable peace. The second big speech he gave was a Memorial Day address in May of 1942, in which it was entitled, "The Age of Imperialism is Ended." Now, you can find in the scholarship that Welles did this on his own. I am here to say that there is no way Welles would have done this on his own. Welles worked for Roosevelt, and he was a close family friend. He was very close to Eleanor Roosevelt. As a 12-year-old boy, he'd been a page in Franklin and Eleanor's wedding in 1905. He went to the right schools as far as Franklin Roosevelt was concerned. He went to Groton and then to Harvard. He worked with Roosevelt. Roosevelt, contracted polio in 1921, and he made contact with Welles after that. Welles had become a specialist in the State Department dealing with Caribbean and Latin American affairs. And he and Roosevelt spoke in great length on numerous occasions while Roosevelt's trying to come to terms with his paraplegia. And it's very clear that Welles's influence, his understanding, he wrote a fat 2-volume history of the Dominican Republic, which is why I don't know, but that was his effort. But anyway, he does this. And this becomes the basis, really. His understanding of how you should treat the Caribbean nations becomes the basis of Roosevelt's good neighbor policy toward the Caribbean and then to South America. It's a mirror image of what we see today. We see what we see today as a restoration of the kind of heavy-handed American foreign policy in the Caribbean and in South America that characterized nearly all of American foreign policy up to 1943. Now, I see Roosevelt as a symphony conductor in some ways. He's orchestrating this to go through. How do you figure out how do you move this forward while you keep things going and not encounter the enormous hostility of those who are opposed to any participation in the world? All right. The second example is Wendell Willkie's journey around the world. He went around the world 7 weeks, 31,000 miles, from late October 1942 to his return 7 weeks later. Willkie became a celebrated proponent of internationalism. Remember, he'd been Roosevelt's opponent in 1940. Here he is, ready to, and he becomes this enormously powerful spokesperson for internationalism. And he published a book called America First, except that his understanding of what Americans had to resist American First and the narrow nationalism that America First represented. He supported an end to colonialism. He supported an embrace of equality of opportunity for all. He wanted the world to be opened up. And a lot of this comes from his private conversations with Franklin Roosevelt in the fall of 1942 before he embarked on his journey. He and Roosevelt became fairly close friends. And at one point, Roosevelt even explored the possibility of Willkie being his running mate in 1944. Or could they work together to build a progressive party, relying on the progressive wing of the Republican Party and the progressive wing of the Democratic Party? Because one thing that's easy to overlook is that after 1938, Roosevelt may have had a Democratic majority in both houses of Congress, but he did not have a governing majority because the Southern Democrats, combined with conservative Republicans, blocked nearly every domestic initiative that Roosevelt supported. And in fact, there are a number of examples where Congress overrode his vetoes at different times, and it was a very difficult time for him. Now, in addition to this, this is Sumner Wells here on the left. You see my left anyway, and Wilkie leaving on his journey. And Wilkie was a dynamic person, and he might have been a very good president. He might have been a good running mate with FDR. His problem was he died. He had this massive heart attack. It wouldn't have lasted. He died before Roosevelt, and that's not a good sign. And here, Roosevelt also did what Wilson did not do in trying to get, when Wilson never relied on Congress to deal with the League of Nations. And you see the first four people across here, Ball, Burton, Hatch, Hill. This is so-called B2H2 group that devised a scheme for an international organization in 1942 and wanted to promote it almost immediately. Roosevelt cautioned them, and he got them to slow down, because he had two basic reasons for this. He did not want to open up congressional hearings or the possibility that the isolationists could challenge what his ultimate goals were. Secondly, he didn't want to get into a discussion of this sort of thing before he was certain that Churchill and Stalin would go along with it. He understood that Churchill and Stalin and Britain and the Soviet Union had to be part of the post-war settlement. Now, keep in mind, Roosevelt's the kind of person, he always saw the world in shades of gray. He's willing to accept compromises and so on. He was never one of these political leaders who viewed the world in black and white, like his successor, Harry Truman, did. And that's a burden. But Roosevelt, and everyone says, well, he's a trimmer, he compromises too much and so on. But keep in mind, Roosevelt never loses sight of the goal. He may not have, I'll repeat this to you, but he knows what the destination is, but he doesn't have a roadmap worked out yet. So he's going to work through different ways of trying to get to that destination. Now, the other group here, the 8, that's a committee that of members of senators that the Secretary of State Cordell Hull put together to help push through different elements of the various proposals dealing with internationalism in the Senate. Now, these 8 men were selected by Hull after consulting with Roosevelt. And Roosevelt understood who could help. What you see here, of the 12 men, there are 6 Democrats, 5 Republicans, and 1 progressive, Hiram Johnson of California, who was an old line isolationist, but he learned and came forward. Now, the next phase of what Roosevelt's doing is to rehearse this. Let's show that we can cooperate and achieve things without having to do it solely in wartime. It's easy to build a coalition, a supporting coalition, if you've got a common enemy. But what Roosevelt wants is support for these noble goals of maintaining a stable peace in the years after the war. And what happens here is that you see Frank McDougall. He's an Australian expert on food security in the 1920s and 30s. And he talked to Eleanor Roosevelt, and she was taken with what he wanted to do. And McDougall said he approached her because he read the 4 freedoms, freedom from want, and he wanted a proposal for dealing with how to address this problem on a global scale. They created an organization. Roosevelt talked to his Sumner Wells. Wells organized a conference of the Food and Agriculture Organization meeting for May and June of 1943. Roosevelt celebrated this by making the point that that's not right, too far. It's the first conference for the United Nations. First time there was a United Nations conference, and it takes 2 more years before they get the UN Food and Agriculture Organization created. But anyway, Sumner Wells was the organizer of this. And Roosevelt once said about Sumner Wells, when someone said, "Why do you have him with you all the time?" And he says, "Because I like him. He does what I tell him to do, and he gets things done." And that's Wells helps write the Atlantic Charter. He drafts he prepares this organization, and he becomes a significant figure in drafting the actual text of the United Nations proposals. So anyway, the next step taken is the creation of the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRRA, UNRRA. Now, after the First World War, there was a tremendous dislocation that produced widespread hunger, and it took Herbert Hoover to organize this. He did, and it was done by private agencies. Recalling that, Roosevelt talked with representatives of the United Kingdom, USSR, and China, and they created the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. And eventually, this was endorsed by 40 nations, and it becomes the first United Nations organization. The first conference is the food conference. The first organization is the UNRRA, and UNRRA exists until 1947 or 48, I think it is. But it provided support for more than 700,000 refugees in Europe and in China in the years after the war, paid for by the United States. We paid 70% is a low percentage of the funding that was actually provided to UNRWA. But Roosevelt understood that the only country that's going to have any money once this war is over would be the United States. This is signing that agreement with the Chinese and the Russians and the Brits in November of 1943. Then some of you may know a lot more about this than I do, but the Bretton Woods Charters, the primacy of economic security and economic stability. Bretton Woods, New Hampshire was the site of this major economic conference in the summer of 1944. I know you know a lot more about it than I do. But it creates the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And these become global sources of economic stability in the years after the Second World War. And they last, I think, up to about 1973, I think is sometime before they stop playing a major role in the conduct of global economic affairs. But the important thing here is cooperation, getting everybody on board. And the people behind this, there's Henry Morgenthau was the Treasury Secretary of the United States, and John Maynard Keynes were there. Mariner Eccles, the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, was there. And then Harry Dexter White, the principal representative from the U.S. Treasury Department. And White's I'll just stop at a little aside. He's a kind of a controversial figure because there's always some hint that he was a spy for the Soviet Union. And part of this is just shaming him in some ways. But part of it, he did make available to different Soviet representatives certain supposedly confidential draft of papers and so on from dealing with the international financial world. And one thing it does do is it keeps the Soviet Union involved. In fact, the Soviet Union does not leave the Bretton Woods organizations until December of 1945. They stayed in and tried to find some way for, I don't know how you mesh a command economy and a market economy in this kind of organization, but the Soviet Union stuck to it for a while, probably just expecting to get some money from the United States. Now, once you get through these rehearsals, you start getting down to very specific things like a subcommittee in the State Department that's going to create a draft of what a new United Nations structure would look like. And there are really just two people behind this. One is James Shotwell, Columbia professor. He crafted the plan. It's really his work. And he had enormous experience. He'd been a member of the what was called the Inquiry in 1918 and 1919 at the treaty in Paris, the Peace Commission there. And so he'd been involved in drafting the League of Nations Charter. Furthermore, he was also involved with Secretary of State Frank Kellogg in drafting the so-called Peace Pact that was supposed to outlaw war in 1928. Along with this was Sumner Welles. He's Assistant Secretary of State, and he gets to he plays a significant role in just keeping things moving. Welles knew how to use Roosevelt's reputation. He knew how to use, and he was very close to Roosevelt. If you look at the White House log of visitors, Welles' name appears over 400 times over the Roosevelt presidency. And that doesn't count the times when, in those days, you could still walk into the White House. And Welles's office was in if you remember what Washington looks like before it's destroyed right now. You look at the White House, and if you're facing the White House, and you've got the Washington Monument behind you, you've got the Treasury Department on your right, and you've got what is the Executive Office Building, we call it now the Eisenhower Building, I think, on your left. At that time, it was the State, Army, and Navy Building before the Pentagon was completed. And so Welles would often just walk over to the White House, and he could walk in to see Eleanor Roosevelt. He could walk in to see, he could walk down to the swimming pool to see Roosevelt his afternoon swims and things like that. He had access, and a lot of people were really resentful of his easy access to the White House. But he kept up with these things, and he did what he needed to do to keep his position. Now, the plan for the United Nations was submitted to FDR in December of 1943, and FDR approved it in February of 1944. And it became the basis for an international conference represented by 44 countries in August of 1944 that met at the Dumbarton Oaks Estate in Washington, D.C. And that's where the actual treaty, the proposal for the United Nations was drafted. There's a new structure. There's a General Assembly, first called an Executive Council, then a Security Council, and an International Court of Justice. But there are two great issues that remain: the representation of the Soviet republics in the General Assembly. Stalin wanted representation of all the Soviet republics in the General Assembly. It starts out to him. The second thing was the question of the veto over the UN actions. And Roosevelt received almost daily reports from the leader of the American delegation, the new Secretary of State, Edward Stettinius. And Stettinius finally threw up his hands and said they had everything resolved except these two issues. And he wrote in his journal after that, "This brings the whole conference to a climax. We are deadlocked. And for the success of the whole undertaking lies in the balance on this one point." And so it could all have come apart here. And that's what the Dumbarton Oaks Conference looked like for almost 2 months in the heat of Washington and so on. Now, Yalta becomes crucial for Roosevelt. Yalta is this celebrated final meeting of the Big Three involving Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. There were numerous outstanding issues that had to be resolved among the three of them. And Roosevelt was determined to maintain a high level of cooperation. But two stood out for Roosevelt, for FDR. And I know there's a lot of talk about how FDR wanted to have wanted to have Russia, Soviet Union, declare war on Japan once the war in Europe was won, and this sort of thing. But what drove Roosevelt to Yalta was the United Nations. He had two problems here he had to resolve for sure. One was, would Great Britain and the Soviet Union actually join the United Nations? Because they were making plans for the first United Nations meeting to take place in San Francisco beginning in April of 1945. And he was never certain. Churchill was never enthusiastic about the United Nations. He wanted the British empire simply restored to its pre-war prominence, and he didn't want anyone meddling with the British colonies as well. Stalin had his own goals, and they involved largely territorial acquisitions in Eastern Europe. And remember, the Russians had lost a great deal of territory at the end of the First World War because of they signed a separate peace. And all Stalin is trying to do, he was very predictable in this sense. all as a typical Russian. He just wants to recapture all of that territory that had been Russian territory. In addition to this, Stalin has a good sense of history. Russia had lost a major conflict with Japan in 1904 and gave up territory as a result of that. Stalin wanted that territory, half of Sakhalin Island, concessions in Manchuria, restored to the Soviet Union. And Stalin held out hope also that when Japan was finally defeated, that the occupation of Japan would be zoned like Europe was, like Germany was. And while that was never really, Americans never really thought in those terms, but Stalin did. He wanted a piece of the action in Japan. All right. Now, they finally worked out a compromise at Yalta, and Roosevelt really got what he wanted when Stalin accepted the compromise, that they would authorize a two-thirds majority on the Security Council for any action that the UN would take part in. And the 5 permanent members could veto any substantive decision. Stalin accepted this compromise. And as the Soviet Union, as one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, could defeat an action by the United Nations. And that's
for the Soviet Republic to be represented.
Well, there are 2, Belarus and Ukraine, were before the collapse of the Soviet Union. That was that wasn't worked out until San Francisco. And Roosevelt tried to keep it quiet because he knew it would create a great deal of hostility in the United States. And so they agreed to carry this over to the San Francisco meeting. And that's where it was left. Now, Roosevelt returned. This is the Shumatov portrait that was Elizabeth Shumatov was working on a portrait of Roosevelt the day before he died in April of 1945. And you can see how I like this, even though it's a watercolor and it's very unfinished. I think it just conveys how I don't know how he lived this long. He had congestive heart failure. The only medicine I think they had for him was digitalis. I don't know exactly what that would do, but he had enormous blood pressure problems. He had things like blood pressure sometimes would show 250 over 200, and it seems like it just blow the top of your head off almost. And but anyway, Roosevelt reports to Congress on March 1, 1945, and this is where he stayed. And what's interesting about this? And this sort of bookends his public career. This is the only time as president where he makes any reference to his infirmity. He thanks Congress for allowing him to remain seated while he makes his formal report, so he doesn't have to lock his braces and go through the painful process of trying to stand being held up by the braces themselves. The only other time he made a reference to his paraplegia was in October of 1928, when he first ran for governor of New York. And he gave a radio address in October of that year in which he talked at length about the advantages he had trying to overcome the problems of polio, and that he believed it was time for the state of New York to assume responsibility for helping all of those who'd faced this same kind of problem, since not everybody had the access to resources he had. But that speech in October of 1928 and the February 1928 report to Congress bookend his public career. And he begins and ends with some reference to his infirmity. All right. Now, there's a passage here from a speech that he never finished. He had a radio address scheduled for April 13th, the day after he died. And it was the Jefferson Day dinner of the Democratic Party. And he talks about the importance of peace. He says, more than an end of this war, an end to the beginning of all wars. Yes, and forever to this impractical, unrealistic settlement of differences between governments, the massive killing of peoples. Today we move against, and this is his phrase, the terrible scourge of war. And that's what he really aimed at in the creation of the United Nations. That's the first step in trying to create a stable peace, is to prevent war between major powers. That's in his mind, that was his great goal. Now, understand this. The United Nations Charter is fundamentally an American document. If Roosevelt doesn't push it, there is no United Nations. It's conceived by Americans, negotiated by Americans, and made possible by Americans. The charter sought to end the scourge of interstate war. FDR never wavered in the idea of interdependent internationalism as a means of assuring an enduring peace. He knew his destination, but he had no roadmap, and it took time to work out the route he needed to take. There you go. That's it. That's my defense of Roosevelt and the United Nations. How's that? No, I just